Bit of background. Name's Daniel. I work over at bandwidth.com. You may have heard of them. They do the public wireless carrier. That's a sub part of the company over there. I work on this team they call the incubation team. And so we have the fail fast mentality, in which we try to do something that's not been done before inside the company, do it as best we can, do a retrospective and fail fast, and then make the change. Unfortunately, or fortunately, if you will, the project that I got put on is called Read To, and it's not so much the fail fast mentality, more so than we're going to try to replicate and exceed the functionality and features of Google Voice. It's not meant to be a Google Voice clone, but it is gearing up to be that way, and that's excluding the new Hangouts announcement today. So I came on at Read To in about February. And it kind of put me on there as like the test tools automation guy. So my primary day-to-day is to find tools and frameworks that we use to make the developers' lives easier, increase their code quality, increase the quality of the app, user experience, the whole thing. And so when I first came on, there were very little to no tests for the mobile app suite. And so that was one of the first things I was tasked with. So I'm going to kind of walk you through how we made our decision to use Calabash or bring into a bandwidth. Take you through some of the other options that are out there that we discussed, and then kind of show you an example of a cross-platform with a writing test to test both an iPhone and Android app. That would be this, like a same app for the same phones, different OS. And then walk you through how to create a new test, and then go over some best practices and some lessons learned about experience that hopefully if you guys decide to go on this path, you don't replicate, and it'll be a little bit better for you. So first thing first, we had to come up with some requirements. After doing some research, one of the main things that I found is it needs to be cross-platform. There are a ton of test materials out there for just Android, for just iOS. I think Darren said you had an iOS talk about a month and a half or 2 months ago. So that wouldn't work for us because our Android app is a flagship. And then one of the things I really wanted to see was built into this new awesome continuous integration platform in which each commit to your master branch, or really every pull request, or anything that you do is built automatically, and the tests run against your app, and you find out your results. That way you don't accidentally merge a bad commit, and you don't have to worry about should run the test, but in theory, you could just do a pull request, and whoever is viewing your code sees the test results. They don't have to download the code, pull the branch, go through, load up the code, and do it themselves. That's still a pipe dream for us right now. It's something that I am trying to get in place, but it's doable with the Calabash framework. Spoiler alert. And open source was kind of a big deal for me. I really wanted the opportunity to contribute back to the tools that I was using if I found something that needed to be fixed. I haven't really done too much with the Calabash. I've opened up a couple issues, and they've been resolved or workarounds. An example is Android's new API 20. They redid the folder structure for one of their tools. So if you had the latest, if you started fresh, the Calabash tools would fail because it looks for a specific folder in your Android SDK directory. And just open up a little request and work around. So that's just good for me. I like to get back. I'm willing to do sort of thing. I guess you're paying for it, you don't care that, right? And then multi-device cabling is another one of my requirements. If you've done any Android development or any app development, you're very aware that Android is fragmented. There's 18 million different devices and variations. I think there was a statistic that I read that you would need 5,200 different configurations to cover 90% of the Android variations. You look it up, it's ridiculous. That was one thing I really wanted to keep in mind. Our app, in theory, we're working on it. We want it to be highly available. Everyone can download this, replace their phone number, and use it. So with those requirements in mind, I found two major competitors. There are more now. This was a decision that was made back in March, so I'm not going to lie, I kind of took a lot of information back from this. So some things may be stale, but from a quick Googling and everything to say. The big one I think right now is Appium. This is by the guys that do Selenium, Salt Labs. You may have heard of them. You may use Selenium day to day. This is their answer to mobile testing. It's based in Node, which is really awesome right now. If you can get past the asynchronous stuff, it's a fun little toy. You may want to shoot yourself a couple of times learning it, but there you go. It uses the UI automation library for iOS. If you're concerned with how it runs, that's how it works for iOS. And it uses a UI automator for Android. And there's a little link to it .io. The other one, Cucumber, Calabash. So if you saw the job description, I'm a big fan of Ruby. I've never done Ruby before. I've done Calabash. And I kind of like it. And there's a couple songs that say Ruby, awesome girl thing. Have to listen to them. It's motivation, right? So going into that, let's take a little bit of the pros and cons of each. So Appium, really cool. You can use any language, really. Just like Selenium WebDriver. If you want to use Ruby and you want to sing along, go for it. In our scenario, more likely than not, we would have used JavaScript. We probably would have done a Mocha test framework if you're familiar with Node. It's behavior-driven development with chai flavoring. That's knowing what I know now. That's what we would have done. One cool thing that we'll kind of get into a little bit, just briefly, is it runs on the production app. With Calabash, you have to re-sign your app with the Calabash driver. So there's a potential for some badness to happen there. Anecdotally speaking, there's none. And Googling speaking, I haven't seen any complaints. And then there's a couple of other bullet points. But the main thing is the Android support. It doesn't support anything below 4.2. And for us, we want it to be available in 2.3. We have about 13% of our users are on Android 2.3 still. At this point, I don't care about them anymore personally, but product owners usually care. So we needed some sort of test framework to support these users that refuse to buy a phone. So anyway, move on to the Calabash, some of the pros and cons. It uses Gherkin, which is Cucumber. We'll get into that a little bit more. Gherkin is actually type of Cucumber. Fun trivia. If you Google for Gherkin, you get pictures of Cucumber, not text. So there are some what they call predefined steps. I don't know if you remember, if you did Cucumber back when they did web testing, they had these web steps that were available. They did away with them. Just because they're bad. We'll get into that a little bit later. But if you just want to start playing around with it, it's super simple. Like the first couple of tests we wrote using Calabash were all using these predefined steps. There's stuff like, then I see the home button. And then I touch the home button. And so it kind of gets into the, it's really quick and easy to write. If you want to show an example, if you're trying to come up with a decision in a week to figure out which framework to do, it's great. I love it. The documentation for it, pretty good. I've not had too many complaints. I'm not a huge fan of Google Groups for discussion boards, but it works, it's functional. And this, I put on there that when this started, may not happen. They were talking, this was big back in March when I was looking at this. They've recently been acquired by Xamarin. You may have heard of them. They do a kind of a cool little C# method that you kind of program once and compile down to Android or Java or Android, iOS, Windows, maybe BlackBerry. It's the right ones compile, debug forever. So they own Calabash now, but it's still supported. It's still open source, so they're going that straight away. It's actually important. The App Explorer, I never use it. It's just great looking your app. But it is a pro. It exists, right? You do have to define different page objects for each platform. Appium, I'm pretty sure you have to do the same thing, but I haven't really had a chance to play around with it, so I can't speak to it. Ruby backend, people don't like Ruby. I don't know why. But if you don't like Ruby, then Calabash is probably not for you. You probably need to use Ruby. And then finally, multiple packages. So you do have to install a bundle or brew or sudo apt-get or whatever. There's one for iOS, there's one for Android. It's not just a apt-get install Calabash. There's a Calabash Android and a Calabash iOS. And with that, there are differences between the two. However, they're not that big, and I've been able to get around it. And I think it's fine. All right, so Gherkin, just kind of give you a little bit of background. So what's going on here is, full disclosure, I went through and forked the Calabash example on GitHub for a cross-platform app. And they use the open source WordPress app. Didn't really feel like bringing the Ring 2 app for you guys. That'd be awesome. Not even a good teaching tool. Tests are kind of messy. There's a lot of learning in there. You're better off showing you a little bit concise, try to help you expose you to Calabash is what it is, what it's capable of, and then kind of see if you start using it, and advantages of it. So Gherkin, anybody familiar with how Cucumber Gherkin statements bubble? So it's this given, when, then. Pretty simple. So basically you want to define the state that you're in, given I'm about to log in, so that's what I'm about to do. When, your action, when I enter invalid credentials, and then your result. Then I'm prompted with correct credentials. So very business logic-y. Get into some of the advantages and the dream of Cucumber languages a little bit. But the WordPress app, I'll show you a little bit. So that's what this looks like. So this scenario right here is testing an invalid login and this feature for login. So the feature, you ever log in, that's your feature. So in Ring 2 land, a feature would be able to send a text message. So I would have a text message feature, in which I'll find different scenarios that I would use for that feature. Something like, given I'm about to send a text message, when I insert a non-ASCII character, then I should be prompted to not do that, or something along those lines. So again, scenario, action, result. It can get long, that's fine. We'll get into a little bit of that later. One thing I do want to point out here is that the given statement there, it's actionable at that point. I was talking with a coworker, and his flavor was that he would rather have, given I'm on the login page, then I do something and I do something else. And we kind of went back and forth, and we'll bring it full circle. But the key point in that is that the step definition, the steps that you define here, you can reuse it. That's the goal. Usability. So that's what our scenario right there, a feature, right, is based on that screen there. So you can kind of see how it would work. I'll take a look at this valid one real quick. So given that you're about to log in, students that were at this page here, and you enter valid credentials, that's using a fixtures file. I'm not sure if you guys are used to folder structures, but some apps require you to, depends on your way. Some people, if my senior dev, if he wanted to do this, he would say every single one of them is on a creating new account. Each test should be able to exist on its own without any pre-required data. It's not always the easiest thing to do. So in my case, I use a fixture file, which I have common data that I preload the database with before I start the tests. So I know that this data is there. He would say that apps should make the data every time. If it's in philosophy, he doesn't have to program it like me. And so this guy right here, this bottom one, this takes you to a final statement, and I can see most of the site. That's basically confirming that it logged in. So I'll walk through the example and show you. Unfortunately, I can't show you the Android unless you guys want to kind of stand on the screen here. But I do have the iOS simulator up. We can talk about that a little bit.
So is there an Android simulator as well?
There is. I have not had much luck personally running that with the test. It is certainly doable. My coworkers have done it. It's a configuration magic. It's something I'm working towards doing to get the Travis builds to test the apps. You need to run in the simulator. There's some, I guess we should talk about it. So there are, so Xamarin and I'll talk about purchased Calabash. They offer this really cool thing. Expensive, cool. It's called Xamarin Test Cloud. So the idea is that you would send the test cloud, your app or your APK or both, along with your Calabash tests. And it takes it and it distributes it down. I forget how many devices they have. They have just racks of servers with phones sitting on them, just pictures there that I can show you. And it actually runs your tests on the devices there. And it'll take screenshots, and then it puts it in this nice little UI so you can scroll through each one of your steps and see, okay, next step, what does all these things look like? And it kind of helps catch. Like if you develop consistently on a 5-inch screen, that's what you have. You get someone at a 2.3, one of these old internet. It may not, it probably look like crap. You don't know. You've never tested on it. So this is a way that it distributes out to all the different guys out there. All the different iPhones, iPads, tablets, everything. In theory, everything. It's quite expensive. I think they're quote for us for how you get charged per device hour. I think it looks between like $2,500 for us right now. And we're still in the see if we're getting a decent test suite. I think if we had a comprehensive test suite, it could be worth it. But then again, if we're in this incubation, fail fast, $2,500 is a tough cost. Although we just been picking up priorities here. And there's another guy out there called AppTwack. AppThwack. Something like that. It's the same type of service. It's cheaper though. I don't know how well supported it is, but essentially, if you use, there's a bunch of tutorials for Jenkins. I don't use Jenkins. I did in the past, but I'm focusing on Travis now. There's hooks you can make. It's not that difficult. You just send them the app to their API. They define and send them passes. So yes, back to the simulator question. You can. My short-term goal is to get the simulator running in this Travis machine against the tests. And even though that's not relevant to a device, it's still a good. It's better than nothing. Right now, it just builds the app. So let's move on. So the Calabash flow, you said you had some familiarity with Cucumber. So you basically have 3 files for each test you need. You have a feature file, step definitions file, and a page object for a cross-platform. And so let's kind of look at that, how it all works together. You start off, the first thing you should write your feature file. Basically, this is defining what happens. Given I'm about to log in, I'm going to enter invalid credentials, I'm presented with a prompt to fix them. So your feature file contains scenarios. Scenarios are anything from an invalid login, valid login, whatever you want to define in that. Pretty straightforward. There's no one going to tell you wrong if you're doing tests, in my opinion. You may have suggestions, but no one's going to say, don't do that. Each scenario contains steps, as we looked at, given about the login. Each one of those steps are called to step definitions file, which is we're still in the platform agnostic realm here. And then those step definitions have pointers which call Android specific and iOS specific code or page objects. More likely than not, you will have common functions that you will probably not want to have in a specific page. And so that's kind of how I put that there. And this is platform dependent. So anything in this red box, you will have to write for Android and iOS if your app is cross-platform. There's some flavors here that we'll talk about, and some tricks that I found out about today, so take them with a grain of salt. However, you may know more about Ruby than I, so you may know use them out of it. So all together now, your feature file points to your step definitions. Kind of like this in Ruby right there. Each step has to be defined. At some point, it will fuss at you if it's not. Steps are global. They're reusable between these features. Only define it once. If you define it more than twice, it will complain at you. It'll make its best guess as to which one to use. You can do force flags and all this other stuff. Basically, if you define step more than once, it will fail. Step definitions called the page objects. We went over that, and the page objects are platform dependent. So we kind of talked that before. So let's take a look. So again, let's go back up here. Sorry. Again, this is our screen that we're testing. We're just testing the ability to log in, right? That's our feature. You have a log in. It's a cool feature, most apps have it now. So keep in mind that picture there when we start looking at the stat definitions here and the page file. So actually, we'll kind of go a little awkward with it here because the Android and iOS apps are a bit different, but maybe this will help. Does that help? Does that make sense a little bit better? So this is Android's iOS. Okay, so we have a trait. Okay, let's look at the step definition. You'll see this await. If you start looking at the code, if you ever look at examples, you'll see this await everywhere. Basically what that is it is a wait for exists. You get that guy for free from the superclass A-base, the Android and iBase and iOS. And basically it calls the trait. And essentially it is waiting, it awaits that trait to appear. So that's kind of like your identifier for that particular string. But for this page, in this instance, is the text that says sign in, which is right here, this guy. So that says, I am on the login page if, and only if, I see this object. Kind of like sorting in, most of you guys probably plan on saying, yeah. So you have the same type, you usually want to have some sort of anchor that you can hold on to and say, I know where I am, using a point of reference. And then we also have down here this add self-hosted site button, which is not here. I can't show it here, sorry guys. I'll have to uninstall that. Basically, it's very specific to this app. It's business type logic. So we'll take a look. For any questions on how this is kind of stitched together before we move on to iOS. All right. So let's take a look at the iOS step definition and page file. The same step definition, different page file. It looks very similar. Again, the await function you get for free. This is something I learned recently. Before I was defining the await function, I didn't have to. So you get it for free, and you get that from the superclass iBase. And then here we have the iOS specific functions, or the implementations for the functions that we had before. So one thing that you want to kind of keep in mind right here is this .self-hosted site. Note, if you go back, this function name has to be the same in your page objects, right? Because your step definition, it knows which environment it's running. You can do an if environment equals iOS, but we're not going to do that. So the function needs to be the same. If you pop up here, we notice that the self-hosted site right here, same name. The stat definition knows that it's going to call that. If you don't do that, you'll error out, and probably not the worst that happens, I suppose. So let's kind of look at how this guy runs. That'd be kind of cool, right? So I've got the terminal there. So we're going to iOS. We're going to run features, and we're going to run login. So, it's huge now. This is just kind of putting it all together. And okay, so this is one of those little lessons learned things I thought I fixed. There's an option in your configuration file that will uninstall and reinstall an app between scenarios. It is incredibly slow if you do that. However, you run into situations like this in which the app doesn't really have a sign out. You sign in, but you can't really sign out. So this is what looks like when it fails. Hey, there's no way it's supposed to do that. It's going to fail again. So I'm just going to control-C out of this, and I'm just going to uninstall the app here, and then rerun that guy. So I have that disabled and on because it is as well. More likely than not, if you're doing any serious testing, you'll probably have that flag enabled to uninstall and reinstall in scenarios. And it's kind of cool. I mean, this is what it looks like on your phone as well. This is the invalid login. So it's just going to, oh, yeah, real quick. And now we're going to do a valid login. And the same in the middle. The inbound login happened first, so they actually signed in. Scenarios were reversed, our features would fail. That's why that uninstall in between scenarios is important, especially if you're paying someone like AppFlap or Xamarin to run your tests. The last thing you want to do is spend $300 on a test that ran and you forgot to uninstall it in scenarios and you have a bunch of screenshots of you looking at your home. Doesn't help anybody. And so yeah, that's just a real quick Calabash test right there. That's green, looks good, in my opinion. Gives you time, and you guys care. You want to see it run on Android? It looks the exact same as far as that's concerned. You can just kind of look at this little screen. If you don't care, I'm just going to move on. If you actually want to see it or afterwards, I can show you. So that's just the prepackaged example. So that's great. That makes a lot of sense. That's just your overall, this is what Calabash is capable of doing, and kind of what you have to do. So let's really get into it, and let's actually make a new feature. That's where the fun's at, right? That's what you're going to be doing. So let's do a new feature. So I spent some time to figure out what I want to do a new feature with, and I'm going to do one for the help screen. I had this really cool idea for this really awesome feature that I realized that I don't actually work for WordPress, and you're not going to get any of this. It's for you guys. So. Simple introduction to Calabash, not the full suite. So I decided that I was just going to assert, just check that the help screen has some elements that I want there to exist. So first thing you got to do is create the feature files we talked about before. And this is my flow. Please understand, this is how I'm given the app. We'll get into some of the dream of Calabash if you come in a little bit. But this is how I work when I have to do these things. I'm given the app after it's hidden. Hey, this is how my Android dev says, hey, I completed the new text message feature. It tells it if you didn't realize this is a feature as well. But I then go through and write the feature file to match the functionality of the screen. In ideal cucumber Calabash state, your feature file drives the implementation, not the other way around. In this case, the implementation is already done. So I'm just writing the test afterwards. So I'm just going to go through and say, there's a couple things are available. So again, it's given, when, then. So given, I'm about to log in. When I push the help button, which we'll get back over here, we'll take a look at it. And we're signed in. Yes, we are. I'm not a big fan of this app, by the way. I like to be able to sign out. So basically, this is the screen, the login screen again. Tap the question mark. Again, this is business logic. These are steps that I have defined. I'll talk a little bit about predefined steps. I want to make that clear. The ideal situation is that your test makes sense for your CEO, if you will, to read these and go, okay, that's what it's doing, and not having to see all these individual steps at this point. So I tap the question mark. So instead of trying to find the name of that button, I just say, hey, tap the question mark. Just tap it, and then I see the Help Center button, and I see the button to open the logs. And just so you know, for this right here, in Android it's called application logs, and in iOS it's called activity logs. So back to the predefined, I haven't showed you the predefined step. Generic predefined step would be, then I touch the quotes text button. So activity log button. That would fail, flat on its face in this situation, because in Android it's called application log, and in iOS it's called activity log. So I just abstracted that out of its entirety and said the log button. And then I define that step later. Keep in mind, you can use and or but. You won't. Honestly, those are ignored. The given, when, then, and, but stuff, that's ignored. That's for you to read, for you to make sense of it. Some of them, I've seen feature files that I've written. And. Again, that's just defining the flow, that first little prefix, it doesn't matter. So we've got our feature file right now. So this is the first thing I've written. There are no step definitions at this point in my project overall. In our pseudo non-linked project world, there are no step definitions. I have this feature file. So I want to actually get those step definitions and get them going. So you can run the Calabash test for any platform. Just run it. Say you have no feature file, you have no step definitions, and you can run a specific one, little side note, by specifying the line number of the file that scenario phrase it's contained of. And then what it will do for you is it will actually give you the step definitions, or the very boilerplate step definitions for you to implement later. So this is how I generate steps for myself. I just write the feature files and run it. It fails miserably. And then grab those and you gotta say, very generic, very good. So we get that, and then at my point, I'm sorry, you have a question?
No.
Oh. Okay, so at this point, I find it very difficult to actually start writing the stat definitions here without knowing the layout of the app screen. When we can look at this all day, I've got experience enough with this that I can kind of guess what some of those elements are called, but in all honesty, I don't know. I found it just surprised me a little bit. So I find it very hard to start writing functions to assert things and do things without really knowing what this app looks like for me in the, I guess, your view source if you're in Swim, right? What it actually looks like. So they provide something called a console, and I'll kind of show you that right there. It kind of lets you hop into the app and start querying around and inspect the elements. So we'll move over here. Now this should work, but if it doesn't, then we'll just talk about it like it did work. So copy this directly from here. For the iOS one, it's a little bit finicky. Sometimes you have to change your Xcode to define a Calabash specific target where you'd supply with the app bundle. I had a little bit of issues with this, trying to get this working, but I believe, and I'm not going to go into the console at all. It's just more just kind of showing you what it'll do for you. Oh, right, look at that, man, it worked. You guys should be impressed. All right, so in here, we can just kind of, this is the login page. You can just kind of query around. So if you do a query splat, that's everything on this page right here and how to talk to it. So look at it, and you know, there's a tab bar button. It's kind of, there's a lot of stuff on there. And this is right here. The next kind of things that I do just come with experience from looking at this stuff. Like I'm sure with Slendy, you kind of know if something's going to put the CSS type of here, what the class is there. You just get familiar with it. So I have a pretty good assumption that that little question mark in our help thing is probably called help. So the next thing that I do is I just do a splat. I don't know the type of it yet. I just assume it's called help. And I just do a splat, just give me everything that has an attribute called help. And there was only one element in this. I didn't have enough space here to show you. And then it just so happened to be called a UI button. So now the next query that I do, I'm trying to isolate this down because I want to interact with this guy. I don't want 3 of them, and I have to choose inside my program which one it is, and that's not fun for anybody. So I go through it, all right, now it's a UI button, mark, and that gives me one result, and so I know that that is this guy right here. So let's kind of go here, and I'll try to show you. Right, you interact with an app like this, right? So let's pop back to this screen here. That's really complicated. So we'll just kind of look at this again. So we'll just do it. There we go. That just made it bigger. Can you guys see that all right? More or less.
Is query a Calabash command?
It is. So this is the, if you notice when I started the command, it's a Ruby console, but it's loaded through the Calabash driver. And so that's what that start server and background, start test server and background has. And I guarantee you, if you do this, at some point in time, you will spend at least 30 minutes trying to figure out why query doesn't work, only to realize that you did not start the test server in the background. Maybe now that I said that, I saved you 30 minutes. A lot of comments with you guys. So now we'll look at, we'll just do the same thing I did before. We're just going to say marked. And this cat is it's sensitive to capitalization. There, so there's query, so it's flat mark help, there it is, UI button. And then move back over here. When I query for the UI button marked help, I get that little guy. So I know that I want to interact with that, and we'll start looking at how to do that in a second. But does that kind of make sense on how you browse the app's information? I guess if you're tight with your designer, or if you are the designer, you probably know what the elements are named, and you can probably avoid this step, or maybe the step is a lot quicker because you know exactly what you're searching for. So I've not been in that position. If you ever are, let me know how it is. So again, let's look at the page object that we're creating now at this point is for this page right here. So some things I think about. What functions do I need to do what I want to do for my feature file? What constants, what do I need to interact with? For example, in Ring 2, there's a dial pad. I went through and mapped out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, pounds flat for all that. So that way I don't have to do this nasty and I don't have a variable name to call it. And you want to try to keep the names the same between each page file. Even though you're not necessarily using all the functions, but still it's just good for consistency purposes. And we'll talk about let go at the end of the day. So again, on Android, I did the same thing over on the Android app. The commands are a little bit different. If you go to the Calabash website, you can see the iOS API calls and the Android API calls. They're mostly the same. There's a couple of weird things, especially the keyboard. The keyboard input on iOS is different than Android. They recently redid that before. Android, when you would do set text, like imagine if you're doing a string, that's the easiest function. You set text, it kind of goes into the console and then sets the text that value. So if you had something like an auto lookup or lookup while you're typing, it would not work because you're not entering the text through the keyboard. It's just all of a sudden that field went from blank to John Doe. So they recently redid that particular API command or whatever to bring up the keyboard in Android and start typing, like you saw in Calabash we ran before. So that is a bug that I have made a little workaround for that. It's so again, kind of do the same things. And when you look at them side by side, so I'm just going to mention this, and I can't tell you anything else about it. There's something called Ruby mixins, which you may have heard of, maybe right now, if you keep in mind, that allows you to still inherit this superclass, this A base and I base, for your cool await and all your Calabash assertions and stuff like that. But it also gives you the opportunity to keep some of this stuff, like this check button function, is pretty much the exact same. I could keep that check buttons function in another file somewhere that would know somehow that is go to the Android superclass of the iOS class. So I don't know much about that. It's something that when I start doing these Android tests, I'm going to look into. Maybe catch me a couple months and say more about it. That's just a little side note. Keep in mind that you may not have to replicate all of it. And then, so now, we've got our, this is again, my workflow. So now that I've got my page file, I pretty much know what I want to do. I create my step definition. Again, this is agnostic. This will call the same function in each file. So when I see the question mark, same thing, and I had to make a change to the page file. One thing I did want to highlight, let's go back, sorry guys, let's go back up here to the feature file. Note that this help center button is in quotes. When you do that in a step, it wants to regex that out for you. And if you look at the step definition it gave us, it's got this little quote here. So I kind of put some hacky code together. I'm not happy with it. I wouldn't keep this in my project if this was made. But basically, my check button function here, more likely than not, I would abstract it out to a common steps file or a common, because more likely, again, more likely than not. You're going to check buttons all over the place. You don't want to have to go to this random help page to not reuse your function. Put it in a common RB file. And so that's kind of why I did, like, this button name equals help center. That would fail terribly. Like, that would get, so there's no real handling there for user error. You could crash that real quick. That's just to give you an example from step definition here, where it kind of calls this function in the page with the code and describes the feature. So things like buttons, I would abstract out to a common steps. In ring2 land, then I send a text to that phone number there, I'd abstract out. As you play with it, you get the hang of it. And then once you finally get this all done, run the new tests. And we'll do that in a second here. Then I'll do it on iOS. That's proof that at one point it worked, right? I didn't type that up myself at all. So, again, because of our lovely uninstall thing, I need to uninstall this guy. Now, this goes real quick, so don't blink. We're going to run our new feature, which we call help that feature, and don't blink. Let's go slow down. Yeah, great. Hang on. So that basically went through, loaded the help page, and it started with those buttons existing in this specific little world. So that's just a very basic overview of Calabash, how I use it, kind of some of the things that you'll run into if you decide to use this for cross-platform testing. I don't know enough about the other options to really say if you only are an iPhone, that Calabash would be worth it. I don't know. I haven't even explored that option. So keep that in mind if you are specific to a certain ecosystem. Now, any questions about Calabash before we move further? Sure.
Overall question, you're looking a lot at handheld devices. Web pages.
I do the web testing as well. Our web view it's not a web app. It is just a website. Imagine, think like Google Voice is on the web app than we are. It's responsive. Is that the key phrase everyone likes to use now? Responsive design. It's responsive to a point. I wouldn't use it on my phone myself. So we use Selenium Runner and Mocha and Chai to do the website Selenium tests. I'm not a huge fan, personally. I think it's kind of weird forcing JavaScript's asynchronousness into what's inherently a synchronous task. Very rarely does a human being interact with something with 4 mouse pointers. I like the way you're forcing the asynchronous to be synchronous, and you get the promises, you get the kind of complex code. I get that it's fast because as soon as it's done, it lets you know the next thing, you're not dragging it for along. But it's a pain. JavaScript's good, but in my opinion, with that, it's not the best. And again, that's just my opinion. Every other person I work with says I'm wrong, so I may be. It is. It's pretty slick. It's behavior-driven development, kind of like we've got Calabash stuff here. Given when then you have describe, and you kind of describe your scenarios, and it's a bit different than how I describe. In this case, this is kind of, I'm just going to step on. Let's describe trying to log in with an invalid login. It prompts me with a prompt to correct my credentials when we have listened there. I can show you some. Yeah. It's just, it makes sense to me. When you write the stuff in JavaScript, you do the behavior driven describes and it hits. It makes sense. I've just learned JavaScript for the past 4 months, so it's still a lot like that yet. So maybe that's one of the problems. Now, some of the experiences and tips. Now, I just want to talk about some of the best practices that I have determined. These are by no means best practices ultra-wide or throughout the world. So I'll talk a little bit about Cucumber and what we call it. dream is to have the feature files drive the implementation of your app, not the other way around. The reality, at least for me, is that I may be able to write the feature file ahead of time, but I'm going to be writing the step definitions in the page objects after the app's written, and I'm going to be querying around them. It's not quite test-driven development. You can treat it as such, but it's kind of tough to write step definitions without knowing what you're doing. If you're designing it and testing it, maybe you have a little bit of insight to your own mind, and you're able to build it better than doing someone else's code. It's kind of hairy. And the goal really is to have Cucumber, it's all of these things, like this, the circle of single source of truth. Your requirements are your feature files, your tests are your feature files, and then your post documentation are your feature files. We have this one-stop shop for how it works, how it should work, and what it does. And you can run it too. Recently, I kind of an anecdote to hopefully we find this type of design out with the feature files drive the implementation. I have enlisted our UI UX guy to start writing feature files. And then working with him, he defines how this stuff should work anyway. And he normally would write, what do we call it? He had some fancy UI UX terms, but basically, at some point, he needs to write out explicitly how things are supposed to interact. So my goal is to convince him to write it in Birkin, and then pass that to me. I'll write generic step definitions, and then hand those to the Android and iOS developers, and they can write their own files. It's just me for QA for both apps, the website, and two different backends. So the developers have to test for us to have any sort of quality. My goal is to make it as easy as possible for them. So that's just a little anecdote, personal experience there. Just some miscellaneous tips that I've kind of picked up, especially if you have more than one person contributing to your repository. Glance your code. Find this file guideline and enforce it. RuboCop is a really good one for Ruby. Based off this file guidelines, you can find them. There's plenty of tools you can run RuboCop by itself. If you have Sublime text, you can install the Sublime. IntelliJ does it by default. It's great. It just says, hey, this is not Ruby-ness. I mean, it's Pythonic code, it's Ruby-ness code. Obviously, you would want to define your own. Some of the stuff that it fusses at you with don't make sense in Calabash land. So you'd want to add an exception to that. You want to have some sort of way to assess style. Because when you start looking at pages and files and lines and thousands of lines of code, you have somebody who kind of just doesn't know that there's an 8-line column maximum and you get all the way down here to this pyramid of doom. It's a pain. You just deny the get pull request and say, hey, follow the guidelines. And if you get it in place right, the tool is telling you they messed up, not you. Just kind of say, hey, your code sucks, fix it. It's not all it works. Especially if you don't know how to do it, right? And we'll go back to this again. Don't use predefined steps. You will run into situations where you probably will type in predefined steps, and at that point, that's fine. That makes sense. In my test, the function to go back, to hit the back button, then I go back. It's a predefined step. That's perfectly fine. You want to use that guide. But don't try to make your feature files totally exist in predefined steps. It's just not worth it. You'll hate it, and it will break.
What do you mean predefined as
let me actually.
that you have done yourself in the past?
No, let me show you.
In terms of
Yeah, let's actually show you some of the predefined steps. That makes sense. So let's do Android. Calabash. No. Yes. I'm sorry. I guess it didn't make sense. I'm sorry. Not bad, guys. We see this stuff all the time. It's kind of hard not to know what's. There's a good bit of them. Here we are. So stuff like, here we are. So these are by default. You can put these in a feature file without having to define the steps, as we talked about before, and then the page object. that will just work. They're just in the back end, they're written there. You kind of see, then I touch, this is that quote, then I touch the login button. If I had done this step for the logs for the application, in Android it's activity log, or application log in iOS is activity log, I couldn't use that. My tests, if I was writing my feature file without looking at the iOS app, I did it for Android, my features would break, and I would have to then make my own step at this point to handle that log situation. It's just, it's not good practice. I don't think there's anywhere that says it is.
So are these more like sort of like functions?
Mm-hmm.
What you should do is predefine as long as you predefine the code.
Yes.
And reuse that. Okay.
Yeah, I would call that more custom step.
Okay.
Predefined, I kind of look at it as they give it to us. You can look up a little bit of history of the Cucumber. I think in like 2009 or 2011, when they reached like 1 million downloads or whatever, they took out their predefined steps. So basically, all these just went away. So they raised the barrier of entry to start using this technology, but they increased or decreased the likelihood that you'd write terrible Cucumber. And really, in my opinion, when you look at it, if you're using predefined steps, the cool thing about feature file, then you're writing 3 files for a single test, kind of sucks. But the neat thing is, if you do, like I'm getting a UI guy to write it, I want him to use very business-specific terms, so our goal. Like, then I see the Ring 2 logo, something like that. I want it to be exactly what he had in mind. But then I can implement that, so when he sees it go, it makes sense to him.
So these are kind of like generic tags.
Yeah.
Look around.
Exactly. You know, so then I enter text to write into recess, just stuff like that. I don't, like, when are you going to have that line there that makes sense in your app outside of, with no context? Like, I would rather have, then I enter my name in the login field. At that point. That just seems, this is wordy, and that kind of goes back to my next point. Keep scenarios short by hiding implementation details. You can, I'll show you a little hint, you can use steps to define other steps. So I'll kind of show you what I would do in this step definition of this, this feature file. Let's say I was running a full suite test for this help page. This is something that I kind of picked up. Again, this is my personal way to handle things. You don't have to log in when I tap the question mark, and that's the help to button. Those first 2 steps are just to get me to this page. I would write an extremely verbose first feature that just navigates me to that page I want to start doing the features on. So I would even probably take that instead of saying given about the login, given them on the login screen, and make it uber verbose. Then the next feature, the next scenario, I would say given them on the help page. And then you can combine all of those previous steps into one. Just kind of put them in a quote. I can show you an example, but when you get to it, it's calling the same steps, but when you look at it, it makes so much more sense. It's so much easier. You don't have 10 steps defining how to get to each page, every single scenario. You have 1 step, given I am on the help page. And ring to given about the composite text message. So you just take all those out, hide the implementation details, and get to what matters. And at that point, that's all I've got. If you guys have any questions? Right. So that's the job. The reason I was going to say that is in our incubation team, we have basically decided to use Node as a first try. Basically, if you don't want to use Node for your whatever project, you have to convince your manager why. You have to convince the team why you don't want to use Node. We're trying to keep it one language, and I don't think I could have sold them to use it. They're so hung up on JavaScript that it's been without a doubt. And I think it's also kind of neat that the guys who did Selenium with active, Selenium is pretty powerful. I think a lot of people use that. And I think there's that just kind of swagger that comes with having such a big tool that people assume you do things right. And I've kind of made that assumption with how so. Yeah, exactly. And then all of this stuff is available. I'll give you the link put up or send out. You can download the repository for all the tests and be able to run them, just like I did. I got a link to the GitHub, it's Calabash, Google Coffee, and everything else. If you have any questions, that's all I got. Thank you guys for yes. Yeah, sure. Yeah. I thought about doing that, but I didn't. So I should have. You familiar with Sublime Text? Okay. So this is this particular example here. You guys see that on the side? So in this land, we've got a feature folder, and then just in your generic, you have your feature files, and then a little bit deeper, the step definitions. We have iOS-specific pages. We have your generic iOS helpers and Android helpers. I suppose you could put the features file in, or put this in another like a specs folder, if that's what you're familiar with. You would just have to be careful with your run command because it defaults to look in the features folder. Now when it's generic, you have to specify where they are, right? Most test tools. I'll follow this test or folder structure for Ring2. I think it works well. I have no complaints on it. IntelliJ will actually link Gherkin files to step definitions, which is pretty sweet. Sublime fails miserably at that. And I guess RubyMine, is that the idea? IDE, JetBrains. I'm not, they give us IntelliJ yet. So it does get a little bit weird, as I said before. Each page file has the same functions. So it doesn't know, like when you say, give me this function in IntelliJ, it's like, which one do you want? So you have to name the same, independent, one file, but I keep the Android on the left and the iPhone on the right. Personal organization. As in, you can organize it whatever you want. You're just making calls to files.
Any comments about
Yes. So I have not gotten it working with Travis. That has not been a priority for us right now. And it's just, as much as I want to go home and work on getting this stuff with Travis in my own time, I don't. So it's not happened yet. I've made baby steps for it. The biggest hurdle that I have had so far was just getting our app to build with Travis for iOS and Android. They started off with Eclipse they started making this app a year and a half ago with like SP6, they got 18, and then they moved to Android Studio, which is now built using Gradle. And then we have multiple environments, we have stage environment, dev environment, and production environment. So getting that to build what I wanted it to in Travis was a big accomplishment at that point. So now I have the app file and I have the APK just sitting there. The next thing to do in Travis, if you know Travis, in Travis you have, if you know the YAML, right? But basically like Travis, you define before scripts, basically you organize what executes when. So this would be an after the main, which would be compile the project. After that, we go out, clone my test repository, point that configure environment variables correctly, and call the simulator to run in the simulator, and then pump the results, grab the results, and either fail it or pass it based on failed the build, pass the build. Travis doesn't have as much information out there. This does. In fact, let's just pop over to Xamarin Test Cloud real quick. And I believe they have a list of what. Yeah, Jenkins, there you go. Jenkins, Team Foundation Server, and Team City are the three that they have actual examples for. If I'm curious in using this, they'll talk to you. They're great customer support. They've talked to me for a long time. They really want to sit down and make my project on it, talk about something itself, and then come to the cost. You know, where I that. So I felt bad. Like, it was a good sales guy. I felt bad I wouldn't know. So good on him, but at the same time. It is a per hour thing. No, it's, let's say, in our situation, I would say I don't care about hitting 90% of all the apps. I want to hit the big three. I want to run on the S3 or the S5, Moto X, and some old dinky Android that buy at Walmart for a penny on a premium plan. I want to test on those three. You can specify which devices you want to test on, and then obviously your time is lower, but the initial cost is still pretty high. So let's just take a look. I guess I'm going to go that flat. Same thing. And you actually get to try it for free with Xamarin. You don't get to try it. You have to buy it before you try it. That's kind of a no. But if you're going to buy it, they will basically configure it for you. They will take anything. They're like, send us your APK, send us your test. We'll configure this thing and show you what it looks like if we were about to commit to buy. But I didn't want to waste his time. I didn't want to waste mine. Pricing, so you kind of see, yeah, there you go. 200 device minutes per month for $20. So if you're doing 200 devices, you're going to eat that real quick. If you're doing 3, we saw our test before, ran in what? 12 seconds. So you could, in theory, get that going pretty well. I'm not sure how it'd work in a continuously integrated environment. Like if you're running on every pull request and every commit, I think you probably want to have some smart hooks to know when to test or to manually trigger it instead of relying on Jenkins build to send the APK test every single time you build. Should run up a nice bill like that. You can also roll your own. There's some guy, I think Etsy, they run this blog called Code as Craft. I don't know if you've seen that. It's a really good blog for anybody out there for mobile development. Etsy's on their game, man. That's a really good blog, Code as Craft. They roll their own test server to run it on different devices. So they have kind of what they did, how they did it there.
So you're running everything from console. So if we like a CI, you use anything like command as the data
I don't have anything that I've done. I don't have these running Calabash yet. So I was trying to get that working before I did this presentation, and it didn't happen. Sorry.
Some groups that want to report.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, for us right now, this is more in Green 2 land. Features are priority, more so than quality. That's something that I'm actively trying to change. I want to kind of get it slow down, but product owner, trying to product owner to slow down is not always what I wanted to. I'm just going to be concerned. But the tests we have right now are mainly used to avoid manual testing of new, just generic functionality. So our Android dev has a list, a Word document that's a couple of things and pages long of things to do for tests. So I went through and basically wrote the Calabash test to do those things. So when Google is about to hand over the app to the product owner to validate the final validation before you put it in the Play Store, instead of spending an entire day going through, you could run this test suite in 10, 15 minutes and get the same results. So the app itself has some weirdness that the screen blows and stuff. That's probably, it's kind of hard to cut around this. If the test would fail, you have to take the other rerun to make sure. But that was how Ring 2 uses these tests. I really want them to be log and kept the more historical pattern that we just haven't gotten there yet. All right. Cool. Yeah, sure.
Like if you subscribe, basically, generic testing. But the overall purpose, ideally, is kind of like to be able to have a generic technology prototype something quick. Out of office situation, perhaps, or is it still kind of suitable for static situations, functions?
I don't see I would really find it very, very unlikely that a specific feature Calabash test suite would work on app A and app B. That'd be pretty sweet if you could write and then there's some Selenium tests out there that'll just run, click every button out there, and just kind of give you a report of what if you click some random button you never saw, if all the click is dead, it'll tell you that. There's some programs out there that you can load your APK to that'll do that for you and just push everything. But if your first screen's a login screen, you're not going to get very far. So I have not seen anything that you could like give it a login, like a step 8, get yourself logged in and just touch all of the things. That'd be great, actually. That'd be kind of cool. It'd help us out a lot. The idea, I guess, for this, as it's gone back before, the idea is not to write the feature files after it's been designed. The idea is to write the feature files with your product owner, with your QA, and with your experience guy. And then take that feature file and you give that to your developer. Your developer makes the functionality defined in that feature file happen. So it's behavior driven, but you're defining how you want things to work, and then that drives your development.
Thank you all for coming. If you all have any ideas for future talks y'all want to see, just shoot us a message at meetup@trytalk.org. We're happy to reach out to anybody you might be interested in and just see what happens. So thanks again for coming. Grab some pizza.
A little tiny bit.
I got a stack of business cards there if you want to get in touch with me for any reason. Got it? So,